My name is John Burzyinski. I'm a geologist by trade. I've been in exploration for over 25 years. I work with a fairly successful group out of Montreal on the gold mining side. We decided about a year ago to embark on this Avro program. Knowing a little bit about Canadian history regarding the jet, we were aware that these jets were launched into the lake back in the 1950s. We did a little bit of background research and realized that there had been no successful efforts to find them. In our day-to-day work as explorationists, working for mining companies, we employ a lot of consultants who use high-tech, modern methods to find things.
Kraken Sonar, we're a Canadian company based in St. John's, Newfoundland, and we specialize in advanced underwater imaging sensors as well as underwater robotics.
So one of the reasons that our technology was selected for the Avro Arrow search expedition was because of the very high resolution of the sonar system that we're using and the ability to do all the processing on board the vehicle. The vehicle is untethered and unmanned, so we can launch the vehicle actually from shore where we're going to be operating out of in Lake Ontario. We can send the vehicle out with a pre-programmed mission to survey a specific area. We do 1 kilometer blocks at a time in the search area. It'll do all the beam forming, all the processing on board, and when the vehicle comes back at the end of the day, it just gives us a full map and a mosaic of the seabed. So we can very easily then from that map pick out, are there any targets of interest, anything that we need to dive on, anything that we need to look for.
Typically in our business, we're looking for something that we hope we'll find. In the case of these Avro models, we know that they're there, so it's really just an application of technology and effort to actually discover and find these things.
Pretty well national regret at what happened because Avro was so well known. There was severe strain over the cancellation of the Arrow in our constituency because so many of them, the people lived there, and we all knew somebody who worked at Avro.
The demise of the Avro Arrow, unfortunately, had a significant impact in the aerospace industry in Canada at large. When the program closed and 14,000 aerospace employees lost their jobs at Avro, but then broadly because of the way the supply chain works in the aerospace industry, there were also 10 to 15,000 people who lost their jobs from other smaller vendors and medium-sized vendors who were contributing parts. It was a huge loss for the Canadian aerospace industry with that knowledge and experience. What could have been with that knowledge base and that experience, that I think is what people mourn for.
I recall the first days of the first space shot, and every tracking station in the world at the time of the first space shot, they were all former employees of Avro, and they were identified as such.
At Avro, you all wore a badge that allowed you to go in certain locations of the factory. And if you were privileged to be in the D&D or over in the Arrow program or the Iroquois engine, you had to have a special mark on your badge to get you there. Being in the photographic side, of course, we had the privilege of going everywhere. I would guess that they went a few thousand feet in the air, and I don't think they'd be much more than a mile out.
Yeah, to this day I can remember looking up and seeing the Avro Arrow, and I'll always remember that. And of course, at that time you would never think that it would have become the story it has today.
And our clients have been sort of state-of-the-art finders of concealed objects. In their case, it's been gold deposits that are located underground, and now they're going to turn what they've learned from how to run a systematic search for gold into a search for great historic artifacts.
We're using cutting-edge Canadian technology to find what was cutting-edge Canadian technology.
For a guy whose day job is going out looking for gold mines, having the ability to go out and search for and find the Avro Arrow models is even more exciting. It's a living piece of Canadian history. I'm just very excited to be able to be part of the team that's going to bring these up to surface and deliver them back to the Canadian public. At this point, I'll get right into the presentation here. Just a quick note, that cover shot is the launch of one of the Avro models, and it shows you the scale of what we were looking for. So they were about 12 feet long by about 12 or 15 feet wide, attached to a rocket it was an American Nike booster rocket that was about 20 feet long. The rocket would propel it up to Mach speed, and then they would track the telemetry, and it would send back information to the ground stations. And then when the program was over, they just packed up their gear and left, because in the 50s, that's what you did when you threw something in the lake. You know, it was gone forever. But that was the fascination with this project. As Brian had mentioned at the beginning with his introduction, at the end of the program, they literally destroyed everything with relation to the Arrow, except for a few bits and pieces. They cut up the planes, they scrapped them, they destroyed the machines that made the parts, they burnt the files. You know, there are a number of surviving artifacts. There's a nose cone, a couple of wingtips, one or two of the engines that hadn't been installed yet, a couple of ejection seats, and these were mainly things that they kept for study. But everything else to do with the program was literally destroyed. So we'll get back into that effect, I guess, on everybody at the end of the day. But it was a rationale for us to go and look for these, because they were literally some of the last artifacts left over from this project that everybody had kind of forgotten about for a long time. And they were just sitting out there on the bottom of the lake, you know, an hour and a half directly east of here, just off the southern tip of Prince Edward County. And I have a cottage out in Prince Edward County, so it was really simple for me to go do this. Okay, next slide, please, Eli. The Arrow and the design studies for the Arrow started in 1953 when the government put out the tenders. The free flight model tests occurred from 1954 to 1957 as part of a general engineering program. What the models were intended to do was if it was today, basically they'd use computer simulation programs or large-scale wind tunnels, but they didn't have wind tunnels big enough at the time or computers that were advanced enough to study the effects of what would happen to the wing design at Mach 1 or Mach 2. So the idea of these models being shot off on these rockets into the lake was to get them up to Mach 1 or 2 and to study and finalize the airframe design. So they were actually very important in the finalization of the design for the Avro Arrow. The first Arrow test flight was conducted in March 1958, and then all of the planes were ordered destroyed in April of 1959 on what they called, I think, Black Tuesday. They literally went in and cut the planes up and ran them over with bulldozers and scrapped them. And I've, over the course of the search, encountered a couple of people who had a first-hand I guess, experience and connection with what happened to the planes after they were destroyed. One was a rail worker who was working on a rail line here in Toronto, and he saw everyone was dropping their tools and running down because these freight cars were going by with all the scrap in, and someone yelled out, "It's the Arrow," because everyone knew that they'd been cutting them up. It had been reported in the papers at that time. And he came to one of the events we had, and I asked him, said, "Well, you know, what did you do?" He said, "Well, everyone jumped into the cars and scavenged pieces," and he took a whole bunch and put them on the dashboard of his 1956 something or other, which he then later sold and didn't keep any of the pieces. But another one is a story I'll relate afterwards at the end of the presentation of two young boys who were at the scrapyard in Hamilton. So all of them were destroyed. There were approximately 30,000 workers who lost their jobs directly from Avro or Avro and from affiliated businesses, as Aaron Gregory, who was the chief conservator at the Canadian Aviation Space Museum, had mentioned in the short film. There was about $400 million $400 million invested in the program at the time, which is equivalent to writing off about $3 billion of research today. And, you know, it's I know certainly in our business, in mining, it takes about 7 years of investment before you get $1 out. And you put in a lot of money up front, and it can oftentimes be billions of dollars before you see your first dollar of revenue back. And I think that's one of the greatest shames of the program, personally, is that they were at the point where it was about to bear fruit when they decided to suddenly cancel it. Next slide, please, Eli. The free flight series involved a progressive series of tests. So from 1954, what they were doing is that they were testing the basic delta wing shape. And then towards 1957, the last 4 or 5 models were exact replicas of the flying plane in every detail. They were constructed of the same material, but they didn't have any internal flight mechanics other than being able to control the ailerons or the rudders. But they were stuffed with telemetric equipment that sent back critical information on the flight dynamics of the airframe at Mach speeds. So those were the ones that we were targeting when we started in 2017. We really had our hearts set on finding one of those final models because, you know, something that was everybody would recognize as the Avro Arrow. The vehicles had been in the lake about 60 years. There were other teams that went out looking, but basically when we started ours, it was almost like starting from scratch. Some of the rockets had been found previously, but not the actual models. Next one, please, Eli. So these are some of the previous searches that happened officially. I'm sure there were a few unofficial searchers out there. As with anything these days, to conduct a search out in the lake, you need a license from the ministries here in Ontario. If you plan on recovering something, you need a second license to recover. And in that instance, you have to have less microphones. You have to have a recovery permit and an agreement with a museum willing to accept the artifact and conservation agents who are agreeing to do the work. So it's not as if you can just go out in the lake and look for things. There's a lot of pre-planning that you have to do and licenses you have to get. And then once you have them, you're off and running. So some of these early searches identified a few of the booster rockets. There were some reports of people having found the models, you know, back in the late 90s, and then again in the early 2000s. But when divers went out and actually looked at them, what they found were booster rockets for other programs. The search area where we were doing the work and where the arrows were shot out into the lake had been used extensively by the Canadian military as early as pre-World War II. It was used as a flak testing range, an artillery testing range. After the war, did rocket testing. They tested the Velvet Glove missiles, which were meant to be armament for the Avro Arrow, as well as other surface-to-air missiles and air-to-air missiles. Over the last couple hundred years, there have been a dozen shipwrecks out in that same search grid. Probably a few snowmobiles, shopping carts. Literally littered with things out there. So first of all, a challenge in itself to identify a target, but then to discern, is that target what you're looking for? So we started ours in 2017. We conducted about 3 years of, or I guess three or 4 years of sonar, and we had one recovery effort in 2018. Next slide, please. Preparing for the search, as I mentioned, we had to get agreements with a museum and conservation agents. So we teamed up with the Canada Aviation Space Museum as part of the Ingenium, the National Ingenium Museum System in Ottawa, and the Royal Canadian Air Force, including the National Air Force Museum in Trenton, as well as the Canada Conservation Institute based out of Ottawa. They're the national conservation group. When they found the Franklin ships, and when I first met them, they were actually working on a whole series of Franklin expedition items in their workshop, which was really cool. And so we had some of them seconded to us to come out when we did the recovery effort. So that allowed us to get our permits. We conducted as much research as we could from the previous work that was done, but really it was the prior searches had been done on kind of a poor boy effort. When they had little money, they went out and did a little sonar. They had a little more money, they'd do a little diving. And it's surprising how many things in Lake Ontario look like an Avro Arrow. So, everybody, I think, successfully through all these searches, and it's a great way to raise more money, right? You get the sonar, so we got it this time. And we fell into that trap ourselves when we started. I think the first 3 days, we found about 20 of them. there were only about eight or nine of them. But it's, and that's a function of the geology. Which underlies Lake Ontario. As a geologist, it's a flat limestone unit underneath Lake Ontario, and there are different fracture sets, and so sometimes when they intersect, the rocks break and they form these triangular shapes. And oftentimes you get these perfectly, covered with muscle things that look just like and the divers come up and say, no, you forget it. We used a lot of ROVs too to cut down on dive time. But our lead archaeologist, because you're also obliged to have an archaeologist on staff, Scarlett Genesis, out of Tobermory, worked with us over the past 4 or 5 years. And we had the pleasure of having Dr. Richard Main, the Royal Canadian Air Force historian, as part of the team, and he really helped us a lot digging through the old files, because as much of or I guess as many of the files had been destroyed, there were incomplete records kept of the testing of these things. The initial test of the first 7 was in the documents, but the last, I guess, 4 or 5, which we were primarily interested in, there was reference to it, but there was no record of it. They had videos of these things as well, but there were no reference points, so you couldn't use the videos of the test firings, and they were the classic 1950s type of videos where there it goes, and then all of a sudden it's kind of like that. So you couldn't tell if it was going off course or up or down or west or east. So we did as much as we could with the old data, but literally what we decided to do at the end was to use an exploration company approach, which was we knew they were fired from here. They could have only gone this far based on physics. And we're going to do a grid, and we're going to cover everything. We're going to find all the targets and then look at them one by one, which is what we would typically do if we're out looking for a gold mine. It's a process of elimination. Simple. So we thought. So we got started. Another interesting fellow we had with us was Marc Koecher. Marc Koecher is a well-known diver. He had his own television series. He's gone around the world, and he dove in some of the Peenemünde rocket tunnels filled in water and treasure ships off the Caribbean and all sorts of things like that. He's a really neat character and an expert diver. We've had cooperation with the Canada Conservation Institute, the Coast Guard, a little bit of help from time to time from the Royal Canadian Navy, and of course the RCAF. But the effort was privately funded. When we had some of these other groups in here, largely what they were doing was treating it as an exercise. For instance, we had the Navy come in and do some sonar with us, but we had our own teams out there, and they were helping do some of the good work. And just like us, they found like 20 of them on the first day too. It was really good. We're sure we got one here. It's like it's rock. I'm sorry. We got pretty good at figuring out the rocks after a while. So we got underway. On to the next slide, please. We conducted this systematic search grid. Those squares up there are about 1 kilometer squared. And what you're seeing up in the top left corner is the southern tip of Prince Edward County. Point Peter. There's a lighthouse there. There still is a radio tower set up at a small base, but they built a cement launch pad out there, and they would wheel these rockets out there and fire them off into Lake Ontario as they were doing their tests. And before that, they were testing rockets and things, and they had to coordinate it pretty well to make sure they weren't blowing up tankers of wheat and stuff coming and going, because it's right in the main shipping lanes. And also had to make sure they didn't have too much of a rocket charge in there, or they'd have been blasting the Americans on the other side, right? So it's funny to think of it today, but they were testing. You had a bunch of lab coat wearing scientists out there from the Valcartier, basically Canada's version of the top secret scientist base, firing these things out into the lake, which in itself would be a fascinating, just piece of work to see all the things that they did. But you can see the search grids there. The final search grid where we found what we were ultimately looking for from the beginning of the program is in blue here, the 2020 search grid. And that's where we found the pieces of the final model. Next one, please. This is what the models looked like in detail. So that there were some surviving diagrams in some of the reports that we dug out of the old historical files. The model itself, again, was about 12 feet long and sort of 12 to 15 feet wide. But back to that grid that we were looking at and those 1 square kilometer search grids, our search area was about 10 by 10. So we were searching 100 square kilometers looking for something that's about 10 foot square. Okay. And back to what I was saying about all of the artillery fire and anti-aircraft fire and sinking ships and skidoos and things out there. So, we really had our job cut out for us in terms of looking for targets. Next one, please. So, as a start, and in that short video, we had the Kraken team out of St. John's, they've changed their name now to Kraken Robotics. They ultimately sold that test model to the Navy. It's a neat device. It has very high definition sonar and if you listen to Carl Kenny, who ran the company, he swore you could tell whether it was heads or tails on a quarter at the bottom of the lake in 200 feet of water. But their resolution very close up is about 3 centimeters, I think. And we felt that because we were expecting so many objects on the bottom of the lake that we would go with Kraken when we started this to get the very highest definition sonar. Because certainly the previous teams who were out there were using earlier forms of sonar, and we wanted to avoid that part where we were looking at rocks all the time that might be planes or things. We wanted to try and weed them out with the high definition sonar. So as a test initially, what we did was we built a 3-dimensional model, to scale, of what we would expect. And we wanted to see what the sonar image would look like. And we dropped it on the bottom of the lake in about 60 feet of water. And there in that red circle, you can see that shadow, which is what the sonar target for a fully intact, sitting upright, non-damaged Avro Arrow model would look like. Because what sonar does is it shoots the waves and it throws a shadow. It's the sonar shadow. So you don't actually see the object, but you see the shadow thrown by the positive relief of the object on the ground. Next one, please. Here's a closer view of that. And you can see it pretty much looks like the plane. And again, there's a lot of rocks that look just like that, so which we found as we went along. Next one, please. But to further complicate things, despite the fact that there were so many things out there, and I'm talking hundreds and thousands of objects and rocks, not including the rocks, the invasive species of mussels in Lake Ontario, and this is an example of quagga mussels, which we have in Lake Ontario on an outflow pipe in one of the lakes in Nevada after just 6 months. And these things have been down there 60 years. It's really only in the last, I guess, 40 that the mussels have been a problem. The water was crystal clear, but every single thing down there was covered in a blanket of about 6 inches of mussels. So once we found a target and a shadow, and we sent down an ROV to look at things, you had to sort of interpret through the mussels. Is that a really good-looking rock, or is that the tail fin of a Avro Arrow model? Next one, please. These are the principal targets that we came up with in 2017 in blue dots. These were cultural targets. Again, rocks not included. Next one, please. These are some of when we started going down with the ROV to try and discern or try. In the first 2 years, there was a lot of work just trying to characterize what the sonar was trying to tell us. And we were trying to learn from the sonar so that we could exclude more things and spend more time with the ROVs and divers on real targets. So initially, we'd stop and send down the ROVs on. You can see on the left, this is a tail fin from one of the booster rockets that's broken up, and you can clearly see the back wing and then the booster rocket and the very classic nozzle at the bottom of it, which tells us that it was certainly part of the Avro program of shooting these flight models. They're the only Nike rockets in the lake. The one on the right is a rudder from a ship. Somebody got excited about that and thought it was one of the wings of something, but then we looked at it and realized it was wood, so it's a giant rudder from some schooner that got ripped off in the storm. And I don't know if it belongs to the one at the top. That was actually imaged by a Canadian Navy survey that was out there looking for the Avro Arrow models back in the early 2000s, but sitting there upright like it's ready to sail off tomorrow. We eventually imaged that one too. It was further out in the grid. It's just it's a nice clean picture of it. And up in the top there is one of the Velvet Glove missiles. So you can see a variety of different things that we started to run across. Next slide, please. And we found more booster rockets. The one on the left that looks like a whale tail is part of the cowling from one of those Nike rockets that's peeled off. On the right again that's an actual underwater ROV photograph of the rocket that we saw on the previous slide. And then these two down on the lower left are again Nike rockets that have had most of the wings ripped off, but they're sitting in the sediment. We know from either the sonar or going down looking at them with the ROVs that they were the Nikes because of the very characteristic nozzle at the end. Next one, please, Eli. So at the end of the day, in that first season, those red dots were pieces of the Nike rockets. And what's interesting here is you can see the launch point is basically where the far left corner of the grid is at AO1. They form a very clear line. And we weren't sure about this at the beginning, whether when they launched the different rockets and flight models, because they did this over the series of 1954 to 57. Did they all follow the same flight line? Did this one go off to the right? Did that one go off to the left? It sure looked like it from the old film footage that they had. But what we started to see from the Nike rockets was that there was a very clearly defined travel path, at least for the Nike rockets. So that helped guide us to where we thought we should go find the actual free flight models. Because when they launched them, they got up into the air, achieved Mach speed, and then the rocket fell away, the plane flew, sent back telemetric equipment, eventually ran out of steam and descended back and hit the lake. The first discovery was that summer in 2017, in the midst of the booster field, there's that small blue star, which in itself was very confusing because, again, the rockets shot them up and they separated and they sailed off down into the lake. And we were finding the booster rocket field, and why is this one sitting in the middle of it? So I'll explain that in a minute. Next slide, please. And these were the early sonar pictures of it. On the left was the Kraken sonar imaging, and on the right is the test model covered in quagga mussels on the bottom of the lake. Next one, please. We planned the recovery the following summer. We got the archaeologists and the Canada Conservation Institute people. We organized a boat. We had some of the Navy divers from the Atlantic Fleet Dive Unit come out and assist us. And we got out there in the lake and lifted it. Next one, please. Some of these are slides showing the underwater work. We built a cradle to spec for the Canada Conservation Institute. You can't just throw a hook on it and drag it up, even though that's probably the cheapest way to do it. We built a cage, and we're very careful with it. And you can see on the bottom here in the middle, that's actually John Baird in the middle there standing. He was part of the group. The cleaned off version of what we saw on the previous slide, there was something like 20 kilograms of mussels that they peeled off the top of it, and probably a similar amount off the bottom. But there's the model cleaned up and ready for shipment to the Canada Conservation Institute, and then ultimately the Canada Aviation Space Museum in Ottawa. Next one, please. So we discovered the first one. Ultimately, we realized it was what they called a Delta test vehicle. So at the very beginning of the program, and these records didn't exist when we started. There wasn't any record of these things, which is what confused us about it. And again, even more confusing, why was it sitting in that booster rocket field, not further out in the lake? And ultimately, what we found out through the work of Dr. Richard Main, who uncovered the mystery, and it wasn't so much of a mystery as a clerical thing that they'd done. They were just finishing the Velvet Glove program, and instead of starting a new file that said Avro Arrow test models, they just kind of wrote it on the edge of the file. And so when it got filed off with the Velvet Glove stuff, so no one ever thought to go look for it there. But there were records of these test flights and schematics of these exact launches. And in those diagrams and reports, it explained why this one was where we found it. They had 3 of them. They also had, you can see on this one on the left, they had a booster rocket. It wasn't the Nike booster, but it was a booster rocket. But the second one they fired off didn't have a booster rocket. They wanted to see what the internal propellant engine would do on its own. And it only went half the distance and fell in that same, it makes perfect sense if you knew that at the time. But it was a great mystery to us when we found it initially. But ultimately, through Dr. Main's work, we figured it out. Next slide, please. A few shots of the Conservation Institute and people working on it. This is Aaron Gregory. And they did some x-raying and then removed all the components and cleaned it up. Again, I guess 15 kilograms of mussels from the top. Next slide, please. And here it is, finally on display. They put it on display, I think, in 2019 on Canada Day at the museum in Ottawa. In those records that we eventually dug out, there was reference to this particular model costing $100,000 at the time. Or, fast forward to today's dollars, about $1 million of technology. Next slide, please. So the final series, and again, this was really the object of the search. We wanted to find the ones that looked like the Avro Arrow. Because, that DTV is great. It was an amazing find. It was really fantastic to find it and bring it up, and the Conservation Institute did some really great work, and the museum loves to have it. But everybody wanted to find the Avro Arrow. And so these last ones had a lot more dynamic information collecting systems, because effectively what they were doing with the early models and then the middle series of models and then the final ones that we were hoping to find, where they were using the first couple of series as a test to make sure that they could get all the right information by the time they built the really expensive ones. Because if those first ones cost $100,000 each, you can imagine that these ones probably cost triple or quadruple that. So they wanted to make sure that they had all the systems working perfectly before they fired them. Next one, please. So this is the final search grid, and up on the right-hand corner, you can see our initial layout of the search grid where we searched in 2017, 18. Then in 2019, we lost our minds and went deeper and missed it. It's funny because based on, at the time of the research we did, what we realized was that we were probably way too close to shore, and the sonar was actually taking a lot longer to conduct than we'd initially thought. As an exploration company, we're used to sending contractors out there, and in a month they're done their job, and that's that. Sonar is quite different. You're at the mercy of the conditions of the lake, any wavy conditions or bad conditions, and the teams have to sit on shore. So we lost lots of time to that. So it took us a lot longer to do the sonar and then the availability of the crews. We threw the long bomb in 2019. We got a lot of flat sonar, and it only really left one place left to look, and that was that blue area in the middle here that shows the snot brown where we did the final sonar. Next one, please, Eli. And this was our search grid. So again, what you have to look for out there is really based on the work that you've done to try and figure out where best to look. And we'd done this process of elimination of all these other areas. If they were going to be found, really they were going to be in that block. Next slide, please, Eli. We engaged for this last piece of work, the ASI Clipper, an interesting ship, the Clipper, because it was used in one of the earlier 2000 searches that ended up on the Sea Hunter episode that Mike Fletcher did, in search of the Avro Arrow. And they were going out at the time to film and recover what they thought at the time was one of the free flight models that was reported found in 1999. I think it actually made the national news. I saw a clip with Peter Mansbridge announcing the discovery of this thing. And then they got out there and they looked and they realized again it was just a booster rocket. So we had the same ship, not the same people, out on this second try. Next one, please. And then as part of the local research, we spoke with a lot of, because you're launching your boats from, almost sometimes people's backyards. I have a place out in the county, and you can't do anything secretly out there, especially with a bunch of ships and Navy guys. And, so we got to meet a lot of people, and some of them were the relatives of a former cameraman who worked on the program back in the 1950s, Carmen Johnson. And they showed us some of the clippings they had. Carmen had passed away, a number of years before, but they showed us a bunch of the old newspaper clippings from when Carmen was interviewed during some of the earlier searches. And this newspaper article here, where he's saying that none of them are looking in the right place, was from I think 2004. There were 2 Navy ships out there doing exercises with their sonar equipment in affiliation with one of the groups that had a license, and they were trying to find the Avro Arrows. And he complains in his article that no one's listening to me. They're all, he worked at what was called camera station number 4. And the way they filmed the work was they had the launch point here, and then there was a camera station, a camera station, a camera station, and then Carmen. And he said, none of them went past my station. And so if you want to go to the next slide, Eli, we went out there and found that station because the cement footings are still there from where they did the camera work in the 1950s. And, kind of pretended we were Carmen for a second. And if you're just kind of standing there looking out the lake, there's the bearing. We put that on the firing line that we determined from the discovery of all of the booster rockets. And we were certain at that point that we'd found all the booster rockets, but still not the final models. And they pretty much intersected right in that area that we hadn't searched. Which kind of made us feel good about at least, there's a pretty good chance that we'll find them. And if you think about it, it's funny, and there are lots of other examples of this in some of the great discoveries in Canada in the last, decade. I've heard stories about the Franklin expedition, very well funded. They went up there and they looked around, they didn't find. They looked around, they didn't find. And one of the locals, I think, came up and said, why don't you guys go look in Terror Bay? And they kind of ignored him, and they searched and they searched. And they said, why don't you guys go look in Terror Bay where the ship mast is sticking out of the water, kind of thing, right? Which is ultimately where they found the Terror. And and this was another example where, Carmen was a little bit bitter, and towards the end of his life, he refused to talk to the different people in the search parties who were out there on the lake, because every year there was somebody. Because he was just frustrated that nobody would listen to him. They were always searching too close to shore or too far out in the lake. But again, you can't ever ignore local wisdom. Next one, please. So again, based on what we had, we'd mapped the locations of the boosters. We had some help, including some of the people who'd worked on the program as well, who were doing trajectory calculations for us. And they were all falling in that same area where the 2020 search grid was going to be. We felt pretty good about our chances of success that year. On to the next one, please. The construction of the jets, and right from the beginning of the program, we knew we might be looking for pieces, because when they launched these, they got them up to Mach 2. Mach speed is about 760 miles an hour. If they were running, Mach 2, that's over 1,000 miles an hour. By the time they slowed down and hit the water, they were still doing 400 or 500 miles an hour. And so, we were hoping they might be bent up. And then when we found that first DTV, and you saw in the earlier slides, it had a bent nose and one of the wings was bent in. And that got our hopes up again that, hey, this is really good. We should find them intact. But we were always prepared for the eventuality that we might find them in pieces. And so these are some of the blow-apart construction diagrams from when they built them. The largest piece there is the wing. Again, it's about 12 or 15 feet wide. That piece is probably only about 5 feet long. But if you look at that diagram closely, there are really only about 2 pieces that if they fell on the bottom of the lake would have any positive relief. I mean, if you dropped it like a bucket of parts, they would all fall down flat. And remember, the bottom of the lake is covered in sediment and mussels. So, again, we were hoping to find the intact planes. But I'll draw attention to the lower front fuselage and the tailpiece there. There were a lot of theories as well, before I get onto the discovery here, from the previous searches as to why people hadn't found them. The final models, like the flying Avro Arrow planes, were constructed of a magnesium titanium alloy that was developed by Inco, another Canadian mining company. Magnesium metal is notorious for bursting into flames in either air or water. So, there were a lot of people who said, well, maybe they just dissolved over time in the water, which is why no one's found them. There was one of the search groups who, after having mapped these long furrows in the bottom of the sediment of the lake, had determined that they were going so fast when they hit the bottom of the lake that they buried into the sediment. Which is kind of hard to believe in 100, 200 feet of water that something could be going fast enough to bury itself. It certainly wouldn't have left a track on the bottom of the lake. And again, as a geologist, I know what he was looking at were glacial tracks from where the icebergs were dragging rocks along the bottom of the lake before the icebergs, or ice shield, rather, ultimately melted off. My favorite of all was that the Russians snuck into the lake sometime in the 50s and took them. Like I like to say in these talks, it's always the Russians, right? They wouldn't have cared. They had guys on the inside anyway. So on to the next one, please, Eli. Ultimately, what we found in the fall of 2020, we found a window to get out there. It was COVID, but we did get a break in conditions to be able to go out there with the ship. And the first target of interest that we sent the ROV down on was indeed the front fuselage piece of one of the final models. And we know it's one of the final model pieces because it's got that characteristic shape, and we'll show you again more in a second. We identified yellow paint on the model, and those final 4 models were the only ones that had the yellow paint scheme. The other ones were black or black and red and other colors. So we knew we were looking at pieces of one of the final 4. some of the battery boxes and wires. They don't show very well on that one, but there's black wiring like you would see on an old 1950s toaster, which I guess was the standard of the day. Next one, please. In the red circle and in those last photographs, that's the fuselage, the main piece that we found. Next one, please. And you can see here, and this is a still from the some of the video footage that we had, or photographic or film footage from the 1950s, from when they were constructing them. You can see the piece lying on the ground as they're constructing it. It is that piece on the left there, and it formed part of the front end of the plane. We also found some of what we believe are the intakes from the side, which would have, if it broke apart that way, they would have been nearby that front fuselage. So we found debris. So, you know, ultimately we had success in finding what we were looking for, but the great disappointment, of course, was that we found it in pieces. And in its own way, very much mimicking what happened, you know, ultimately to the Avro Arrow. Next one, please. Again, a couple more shots of that piece as they were constructing it. Next one. So the free flight program, as it progressed from 54 to 57, included 9 models. 2 were shot off Wallops Island in Virginia, 7 into Lake Ontario, off Point Peter. And then these other 3 Delta test vehicles, which we found retroactively the information for in the files through the help of Dr. Main. And, you know, it was a progressive program. We found one of the first, that's in the museum in Ottawa. We found pieces of one of the last. Those are still on the bottom of the lake. We are still debating whether to go and collect some of those pieces. We may do so this summer. We've had an offer of help from the Navy on doing some work there. But, you know, it was a successful search, and I guess at the end, a little bit disappointing not to be able to find the fully intact model. But, you know, certainly it raised our level of understanding of the work that went into the program and the progression of doing it, and, you know, how much time and effort had been dedicated by the people in the program. You know, because in the course of doing the research, you can really go down the rabbit hole on the Avro Arrow. There are hundreds of books and documents and old news clips and things. You know, at the point where if you're not careful, you get really lost in it, and you know, night and day and night and day. But it was a fascinating piece of work. Next slide, please, Eli. You know, again, we found one of the first, one of the last. The first one was intact. It was more industrially made with heavier construction than the last ones. They broke apart because they were hollow, and they had all of that telemetry information in them. When they hit the water at 500 miles an hour, they just kind of blew apart at the seams. And the pieces that we found were the ones with the positive relief that when they settled on the bottom, they would have stuck up, and that's why we found them. I'm pretty sure all the other pieces for these models are nearby where we found that initial piece, but the effort to find them lying flat in sediment and covered in mussels, and they're not magnetic because they're made of magnesium titanium alloy, they're non-ferrous, so they don't show up on a magnetometer or anything. You'd have to literally be down there with a stick, you know, testing things and scraping mussels off everything to see if it was a piece or not. So we bring a close to 20 years of search with success. And again, our hope was that we would find one intact, but you know, we are happy that we ultimately answered the question that no, it wasn't the Russians. And the coverage of the sonar of the area really didn't present any other potential targets. You know, we're satisfied with the density of sonar that we did, that the likelihood of finding one intact out there is very low. We would have seen something big enough. The pieces that we did find were, you know, a couple of feet by a couple of feet, and, you know, it's really a testament to the ability of the sonar operators that we had working for us to be able to find those in a grid of, you know, 100 square kilometers that had thousands of targets and then thousands of rocks that looked like targets. So a very good piece of work by the different contractors we had out there. Next one, please. And, you know, ultimately this is how people remember the Avro Arrow program. You know, it was in that first little video clip too, the planes were destroyed, and there was a lot of bitterness, and a lot of people's hopes and dreams were destroyed that day. Next one, please, Eli. My preference, though, is to think of the Avro program in that moment of time when they rolled the first one out. It was really an achievement for those 30,000 people. You know, in a short span of time, I mean, 5 years from concept to engineering testing to developing a jet that flew and did what it was supposed to do. They just didn't give it enough time. You know, if they'd let that program go, I'm sure that we'd probably still have a few Avro Arrows flying around somewhere, at least at the air shows. But, you know, it was a tremendous feat collaboratively by all the people that worked on it. One of the neatest things that happened over the course of the last 5 years was the number of people that we actually got to meet who'd worked on the program, or were sons and daughters of people who worked on the program, or neighbors of people who worked on the program. And a lot of times we'd be out there doing our surveys and people would come up and, you know, sometimes they were just saying hello and sometimes they had, you know, a piece of the plane. There was one woman who came up to us when we were doing the first year survey and said, oh, you know, my dad worked on the Avro program. So I have these manuals. And it was, you know, sort of top secret manual number 27, interim test flight Avro Arrow. This copy belongs to, corner was ripped off. And so, you know, there were all these fascinating bits and pieces. And we were trying to direct those people to the Canadian Aviation Space or Canada Aviation Space Museum or the National Aviation Space Museum. And they did, as a result of the program, get some of the donations and things. Through the work that we did, we also organized about $600,000 or $700,000 of donations to the two museums to host the pieces that we found and display some of the pieces that were coming in. So, you know, it was a fascinating program. Next and last slide, sponsored by a lot of our banking friends, and thanks to all of them. Again, we've done a lot of business with lots of the different banks and law firms and groups downtown, and they very generously gave of their time and bank funds to help fund the program. But really, you know, it's about bringing back a piece of lost Canadian history, and you know, every good mystery deserves to be, you know, solved, I guess. And you know, really, this was just, you know, trying to mop up one of those last missing Canadian pieces of history, and you know, we were fortunate that we were able to do it. Thank you.